I thought the worst thing that could happen was the accident, but I was wrong. Betrayal cuts deeper than any crash, and what came next shattered everything I thought I knew about love, family, and myself. The shrill ringing of a phone shattered the silence. Diana groaned, burying her face under the pillow. It was far too late, or rather, too early, for anyone to be calling. She hoped it was Martin's phone and not hers. As the ringing finally stopped after the fifth insistent chime, she exhaled a relieved, muffled "thank you" into the pillow. Just as she adjusted herself back into the warm comfort of sleep, the piercing sound resumed. The doorbell this time. She yelled, sitting up abruptly and throwing off the covers. "Martin, answer the words caught in her throat as she reached over instinctively, only to find the other side of the bed empty. A quick glance at the clock on the nightstand made her stomach tighten. 3:37 a.m. She picked up her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as the unease began to set in. Martin had been there when they went to bed. Where was he now? "Hello," she muttered groggily into the phone, her voice hoarse. "Is this Diana Miller?" a voice asked, formal and unfamiliar. "Yes." "Who's calling?" "Are you Martin Miller's wife?" "Yes, for God's sake, yes." "Who is this?" "Mrs. Miller, this is the emergency room at Northtown Medical Center. Your husband was brought in about an hour ago. We had your contact information from the incident last year. He was in a car accident." Diana's heart stopped mid-beat. "Oh my God. Is he okay?" "I'm afraid I can't discuss his condition over the phone, ma'am. Please come to the hospital as soon as possible." Yes, I'll be there right away." She ended the call with shaking hands, her mind racing. Throwing on the nearest sweatshirt and shoes she could find, she hurried upstairs to wake her daughter, Dallas. Dallas, named after the city where she was conceived, attended the local university but lived at home to save money. She had tried dorm life her freshman year, but the constant distractions had made focusing on her studies nearly impossible. Now, her quiet room served as a sanctuary, but tonight, it felt like a barrier Diana couldn't break through. Wake up!" Diana called urgently, nudging her daughter's shoulder. Dallas didn't stir. "Dallas!" Diana said louder, giving her a light shake. Still nothing. "Come on, sweetheart," Diana muttered under her breath, her panic mounting. She pushed Dallas harder, trying to rouse her from what seemed to be an unnervingly deep sleep. "Dallas, wake up!" Diana's voice pierced through the fog of her daughter's deep sleep. Dallas sat up abruptly, blinking against the harsh light that now flooded her room. Her mind felt sluggish, her blurry eyes struggling to focus on her mother's anxious face. "Your father was in an accident," Diana said, her voice trembling. "He's in the emergency room. Get dressed, we need to go now." The words didn't fully register at first, but the urgency in her mother's tone jolted her into action. Without thinking, Dallas rolled out of bed, yanked her nightgown over her head, and stood naked as she reached for clothes. At 20 years old, modesty wasn't her first priority in a moment like this, and Diana was far too distracted to notice. She rummaged through Dallas's closet, pulling out jeans and a sweatshirt. "Here, put these on," Diana said, tossing the clothes at her daughter. Within moments, they were in the car, speeding through the dark, empty streets toward Northtown Medical Center. The silence of the early morning was oppressive, broken only by the sound of the engine and Dallas's barrage of questions. "What happened? How bad is it? Was anyone else hurt? Do they know what caused it?" "I don't know," Diana replied, her voice tight. "They didn't tell me anything, just that he was brought in after an accident." The tension in the car was suffocating. Every second felt stretched, as though time was conspiring against them. The drive, though only 10 minutes thanks to the lack of traffic, felt like an eternity. When they arrived, the harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency department seemed to magnify their unease. A nurse directed them to Martin's room. The sight that greeted them stopped both women in their tracks. Martin lay motionless, his face pale against the sterile white of the hospital sheets. His body was swathed in bandages, and his head was tilted slightly to the side, a thick layer of gauze wrapping his forehead. He looked fragile, a stark contrast to the strong, vibrant man they knew. He was unconscious. "Mom," Dallas whispered, her voice breaking. Diana didn't answer. Instead, she focused on the clipboard handed to her by a nurse. "Your grief doesn't free you from paperwork," she muttered bitterly under her breath, scribbling her name onto the forms with shaking hands. Dallas pulled a chair close to her father's bedside, gently taking his hand. She didn't say anything, just sat there, her lips trembling. They stayed like that for about an hour, each lost in their thoughts and fears, when the door opened. A man and woman in police uniforms stepped in, their expressions professional but sympathetic. "Good evening, ma'am. I'm Officer Gail Stanton, and this is my partner, Robert Hansen," the woman said, her tone measured. "We were the first to respond to the scene. Any news on how he's doing?" "Nobody's told us anything," Diana said quickly, her voice thick with worry. She gestured toward her daughter. "This is my daughter, Dallas." Officer Stanton gave a small nod. "I'm afraid we're not medical professionals, but we do need to ask a few questions. I know this isn't an ideal time, but the sooner we gather information, the better." Diana sighed and nodded. "Of course. What do you need to know? Do you have any idea what your husband was doing out at this hour?" Stanton asked gently. Diana shook her head. "He was at home. We went to bed together around 10 p.m. I didn't even realize he was gone until the hospital called me." The officer turned to Dallas. "Can you confirm this?" "Yes," Dallas said quietly. "We watched a movie on TV that ended around 10. After that, we all went to bed. I didn't hear him leave or anything." Officer Hansen jotted down notes as the conversation continued, his pen scratching softly against the paper. Diana glanced at Martin, her heart aching. The only thing she could focus on was the hope that he'd wake up and tell them all it was just a terrible mistake. Dallas rubbed her eyes, trying to focus on the officer's words. "I saw Dad go into the bedroom with Mom," she said softly, her voice hesitant. "What movie did you watch?" asked Officer Hansen, pen poised over his notepad. "It was some action movie, something with Keanu Reeves. Dad picked it." "It was his turn to choose," Dallas replied, glancing at her mother for confirmation. Diana nodded but looked distant, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. "Did your family have any significant issues, financial, marital, or otherwise?" Officer Stanton asked carefully, her tone probing yet gentle. Diana straightened slightly, her jaw tightening. "No, nothing out of the ordinary. Just the usual ups and downs that come with being married. There wasn't anything unusual or noteworthy." Dallas shook her head in agreement. "Nothing that would explain this," she murmured. The officers exchanged a glance before Stanton continued. "Mrs. Miller, I need to be honest with you about what the witnesses reported," she began, her voice firm but tinged with empathy. Diana's breath caught. "Witnesses? Were the people in the other car hurt?" "That's the thing," Stanton said, leaning forward slightly. "There was no other car. It was a single-car accident. According to two witnesses, your husband's vehicle was driving normally, but then, quite suddenly, it accelerated directly into the large oak tree at the corner of Highways 121 and 288. There were no skid marks and no sign of brake lights. It was as if," she trailed off, hesitating. Diana and Dallas stared at the officers, the weight of Stanton's unspoken suggestion hanging in the air. "What are you implying?" Diana finally managed, her voice trembling. "Are you saying my husband did this, on purpose? That he tried to commit suicide?" Officer Hansen shifted uncomfortably but kept his tone neutral. "We're not drawing any conclusions yet," ma'am. We'll need to inspect the car for possible mechanical issues, and of course, we'll speak with your husband once he regains consciousness. But, yes, we have to consider all possibilities, including that one. Diana's face flushed with indignation and grief. No. No, that's impossible. I love my husband, and we have a wonderful marriage. There's no way he would do something like that. I'm sure it was just. I don't know, he must have lost control or maybe dozed off at the wheel. It was late, and he was probably exhausted. Her voice cracked as tears spilled down her cheeks. There has to be a reasonable explanation. Officer Stanton placed a business card gently on the table. If anything else comes to mind, anything at all, please don't hesitate to call, she said softly. She and Hansen nodded respectfully and left the room, closing the door behind them. The silence that followed was deafening. Dallas moved closer to her mother, who was now clutching a tissue in trembling hands. You didn't tell them, Dallas said quietly. Diana's shoulders sagged. No, I didn't, she admitted after a long pause, her voice raw from crying. You should have, Dallas said firmly. It's none of their business, Diana replied, her tone sharper than she intended. It has nothing to do with this. Your father wouldn't, he wouldn't do that. Her voice faltered, and she sighed deeply. Perhaps when he wakes up, he'll explain everything. Then we'll see. For the next several days, time seemed to drag. Martin remained unconscious, his condition unchanged. Diana and Dallas spent most of their time at the hospital, the sterile environment becoming both a comfort and a prison. They avoided discussing the officers' questions directly, each retreating into their own thoughts, but the unspoken weight of the situation loomed over them. Diana stayed vigilant, ensuring Martin was never left alone. She had grown accustomed to the soft beeping of the monitors, a rhythm that both reassured and unnerved her. Suddenly, the sound shifted, a subtle but unmistakable change. Diana sprang to her feet, rushing into the room just as the nurse arrived, alerted by the same monitor changes. She stepped back, giving the nurse space to check on Martin. He stirred slightly, his eyes fluttering open. Diana's breath caught. He was awake. Relief coursed through her, but she held herself steady, allowing the nurse and the team of doctors that followed to do their work. Once the doctors finished their initial checks and assured her that Martin was stable, Diana slipped outside to make a call. She dialed Dallas's number, eager to share the news that her father had woken up. The phone rang several times before going to voicemail. Dee, it's Mom. Your dad is awake. Call me when you can, she said, her voice a mix of relief and exhaustion. Returning to the room a little later, Diana found that much of the medical equipment had been removed. Martin's left arm was in a cast, but thankfully, he was right-handed, and it wouldn't impede him too much. Still, the sight of him pale and weak stirred a fresh wave of worry in her. Dallas arrived at the hospital about 45 minutes later, rushing to find her mother sitting in a chair outside Martin's room. Mom, she said breathlessly. Why are you out here? Why aren't you with Dad? Diana looked up, her expression clouded. He doesn't want us in the room, she said quietly. What do you mean, us? I understand why he might be upset with you, but why me? Dallas's voice was sharp with confusion and hurt. Diana flinched. What's that supposed to mean, she snapped. And why did it take you so long to get here? Dallas hesitated, then sighed. I had just woken up when Brad stopped by to check on me. She paused before adding hesitantly, we were spending time together. Diana's face hardened. God, Dallas, you were with your boyfriend while your father is lying here. What is wrong with you? I'm sorry, Mom, but he was unconscious when I left, Dallas replied, her voice softening. She gave a faint, apologetic smile, but Diana only shook her head, her frustration palpable. Inside the room, Dr. Lasser, a tall woman with sharp features and a calm demeanor, pulled a chair up to Martin's bedside. Crossing her legs, she leafed through his chart. "It's good to see you awake, Mr. Miller," she began. "You were brought in just over a week ago after an accident, a collision with a large tree. I see here that you've also requested that your wife and daughter not visit. I suspect these things may be connected." She looked up, her gaze steady. "Would you like to explain?" Martin's face darkened. "She cheated on me," he said flatly, his voice hoarse but resolute. Dr. Lasser nodded, her expression neutral. "Unfortunately, infidelity is a common issue in marriages," she said. "But let's focus on your medical condition for now. You suffered a head injury, a mild concussion from the impact. Does anything else feel off or unusual?" Martin hesitated before speaking. "Before the accident, I couldn't perform. I'm guessing that's from the head injury. I tried everything, but none of the treatments worked. The doctors ran every test they could think of, multiple times. In the end, the best explanation they gave me was that part of my brain had been damaged." Dr. Lasser's gaze softened. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said gently. Martin sighed, his tone bitter. "That's when everything fell apart." Diana grew distant. She thought I didn't notice, but I did. She turned to someone else. "Bill." His eyes narrowed, the pain and betrayal evident in his expression. Dr. Lasser made a note but didn't press further. "Recovering from trauma is a process, both physical and emotional. We'll focus on your health first, and when you're ready, we can address everything else." In the living room at home, Dallas and Brad were seated together, trying to process the situation. Meanwhile, in the bedroom, Diana sat in silence, grappling with the weight of Martin's words and the fragile state of their family. "That's how I found out my wife was cheating on me," Martin said, his voice heavy with bitterness. "And my daughter knew about it. Not only did she know, but she apparently approved." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Which explains why I banned her from visiting, too." Dr. Lasser leaned forward slightly, her expression neutral but attentive. "Your daughter approved?" "Yes," Martin replied with a bitter laugh. "Oh, and if I didn't mention it before, the man, Bill, is Brad's father. We'd met him before, just by chance, as the father of our daughter's boyfriend. But later, I found out something that hit even harder. It was my daughter who suggested Bill to her mother." Dr. Lasser blinked, momentarily stunned. "That must have been another devastating blow." Martin nodded, his gaze fixed on some distant point. "It was. And did I confront them? Of course. But it didn't seem to matter. She just kept seeing him." His voice grew tighter, the frustration evident. "And now that I knew about it, she was less careful, less reserved. I don't know if she started seeing him more often or if she just didn't bother hiding it anymore. Before, it was limited to the weekdays when I was at work. But after that, it included errands on weekends. I knew part of that time was spent with Bill." Dr. Lasser let a moment of silence pass, allowing Martin to collect himself. "That must have been incredibly difficult." "Difficult?" Martin repeated, his voice rising slightly. "That doesn't even begin to describe it. It was unbearable." He exhaled shakily, his tone turning somber. "I didn't have a plan. I just drove. I found myself circling around the area. And then I saw it, the big oak tree. It was on a stretch of road I knew well, with no obstacles and a clear, direct path. The thought just came to me." He paused, the weight of his confession filling the room. "I drove past it the first time. Then again. And the next thing I knew, I was heading straight toward it." They sat in silence for several minutes, the enormity of Martin's words hanging in the air. Finally, Dr. Lasser broke the stillness. "Mr. Miller," she began softly, "thank you for being so open and honest with me. That's a rare thing, especially in situations like this." She stood, her demeanor professional but empathetic. "I'll let you rest for now. You've been through a lot, and it's important to process everything at your own pace. We'll talk more later." Martin nodded absently, his thoughts elsewhere as Dr. Lasser quietly left the room. Meanwhile, in her own corner of the hospital, Diana sat with her thoughts. She was grappling with the fallout of her actions, though her resolve was firm. She replayed Martin's words in her mind, his hurt and disappointment cutting deeper than she cared to admit. Once Martin returned home, she decided she would try to be more considerate of his feelings. She would make an effort to be present, to repair some of the damage. But she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward Bill. Their relationship was something she wasn't ready to let go of, not entirely. The next morning, Martin's thoughts crystallized. He was disappointed, not only in Diana and Dallas but in himself. "I'm disappointed with her, yes," he murmured to himself. "More so with Diana than Dallas. But mostly, I'm disappointed in me. For not standing up for myself. For not making it clear that what she's doing is unacceptable." Dr. Lasser's voice from the day before echoed in his mind, urging him to think carefully about his next steps. "Do you intend to change that now?" he imagined her asking. "Undoubtedly," Martin thought to himself. A bitter smile crossed his face. "While I'll admit, I'm tempted to just get a divorce." His thoughts trailed off, not yet ready to fully confront what lay ahead. "I have to take some responsibility," Martin said, his voice measured but heavy with emotion. "I let things drift. I let her feel like she could move on without me. But if Diana agrees to stop seeing Bill, then I'm willing to try. I'll go to counseling. I want to repair this marriage." For a little over a week, things remained tense but uneventful. Then one evening, Diana announced casually, "I need to go shopping tomorrow. We're running low on some things, including your healing creams." "No," Martin said calmly but firmly, his eyes locking onto hers. "What?" Diana's tone was confused, almost amused. "Make a list," Martin said, his voice unwavering. "Dallas can go instead." "Why are you dragging me into this, Dad?" Dallas chimed in, exasperated. "I have plans with Brad." "Then you've got an incentive to finish quickly, don't you?" Martin replied, his tone sharp. Diana stared at him, incredulous. "This is ridiculous, Martin. You can't just come home and turn everything upside down. Dallas has plans, and I need to." Martin cut her off, his voice as steady as it was resolute. "That's part of the problem, Diana. You always put your needs ahead of everyone else's. This stops now." Diana crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "You can't order me around, Martin. I've done my best to help you heal, but I can't keep pretending everything's fine." Martin leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "This is simple. You stop seeing Bill. We go to a counselor and try to fix this marriage. Or you don't, and I call the divorce lawyer on Monday." Diana's face flushed with a mix of anger and disbelief. "You wouldn't dare," she snapped. "Don't test me, Diana," Martin said coldly. Her voice rose, trembling with frustration. "You think I want this? You think I want to sneak around? If I could have love with only you, I would. But I can't. It's not my fault. I didn't cause the accident. I wasn't even there. And now you expect me to give up everything, my needs, my happiness, just because of something I had no control over?" Martin's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. By the time Dallas returned home that evening, darkness had already settled in. She went upstairs to check on her father and found his bedroom dimly lit, with a faint glow coming from the bathroom. The door was ajar, and the light inside provided just enough illumination for her to see. "Dad," she called softly. Martin stood with his back to her, his posture tense. "Dallas," he said quietly, his voice betraying his exhaustion. "I'm sorry," she blurted, stepping closer. Martin finally turned, his expression weary but curious. For what? For everything, Dallas said, her voice breaking. For not supporting you when I should have. For suggesting Bill in the first place. I thought it was what Mom needed, but I see now how much it hurt you. I was wrong. I'm sorry. Martin studied her face carefully, his emotions swirling. He wanted to believe her, but doubt lingered. Why now, Dallas? Why are you saying this now? She hesitated, then said, because I can see how much pain you're in. And I hate knowing that I had a part in causing it. For a moment, Martin's expression softened. He didn't know if this was genuine or just a well-timed excuse, but for now, he decided to take it at face value. If you're being sincere, he said quietly, then thank you. But if this is just another way to protect your mother, I don't think I can take any more deceit. It's not, Dallas assured him, her voice trembling. I promise. Martin sighed deeply, the weight of the past weeks pressing heavily on him. I don't know what's going to happen, Dallas. But I know one thing, I can't keep living like this. Not for much longer. Father and daughter exchanged another look, this time accompanied by a faint, fleeting smile. It was a small gesture, but it carried a world of unspoken understanding. It's over now, Deli, Martin said softly, using the old nickname he'd given her as a child. I'm not going to keep doing this. I hope not, Dallas replied earnestly. I need you, Dad. I really do. Martin sighed, his expression unreadable. Are you going to divorce Mom? Dallas asked hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. I haven't made any final decisions yet, Martin said. His tone was steady, but the uncertainty lingered in the air. Dallas nodded, respecting his silence. With a quiet good night, she retreated to her bedroom, the sound of the door closing softly behind her. A moment later, Martin heard the chirp of Diana's car lock echo through the stillness of the house. The small glimmer of peace he had just shared with his daughter vanished in an instant. The joy that had briefly filled him was replaced with a heavy emptiness. He lay down on the bed and closed his eyes, hoping for sleep to take him. A few minutes later, Diana entered the room. Her hair was damp from a shower, and the scent of soap filled the air. Martin didn't need to ask, he knew she had stopped at Bill's house to clean up before coming home. She had argued before that it was better for her to return freshly washed than carrying the scent of her infidelity. Could you help with the groceries, please? Diana asked casually, her tone light, as though nothing was wrong. Are there even any groceries in those bags? Martin quipped, sitting up. Yes, Marty. I told you we needed things, she replied with mild exasperation, brushing past him toward the closet. She rummaged through her clothes, her mind wandering. She still didn't believe her pursuit of sexual gratification, given the circumstances, was a problem. In time, she hoped Marty would come to feel the same. But for now, she nodded to herself, deciding that any return to physical intimacy with her husband could wait. Tonight, after all, wasn't the right evening for it. By the time Diana changed into her pajamas and climbed into bed, Martin appeared to be asleep. Whether he truly was or just pretending, she couldn't tell. She sighed, pulling the covers over herself, and closed her eyes. The divorce, when it came, was messy but ultimately inevitable. Despite her protests, Diana eventually realized that continuing to resist would cost her dearly, potentially her relationship with her daughter forever. Dallas had made it clear that any further opposition would damage their bond beyond repair. Faced with the loss of both her husband and her child, Diana abandoned her fight. The house was sold, and the terms of the divorce were finalized. Martin agreed to several years of alimony, knowing a judge would likely order it regardless. Diana moved into a modest two-bedroom apartment close to her job and resumed full-time work. It was an adjustment, but one she managed with a mixture of practicality and quiet resignation. 8 months after the divorce, Martin found himself in a bustling bar one evening. The clinking of glasses and the low hum of conversations surrounded him as he sipped his drink, scanning the room absently. That's when he saw her, a woman with long, dark brown hair and a dress that barely covered her shoulders. There was something familiar about her, though he couldn't place it at first. She was standing near the bar, her posture poised yet relaxed. Intrigued, Martin took another sip of his drink before making his way over. As he approached, the woman turned her head slightly, her gaze meeting his. She studied his face for a moment, her expression neutral but curious. "Dr. Lasser," Martin said softly, a small smile tugging at his lips. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and then recognition flickered across her face. "Mr. Miller," she said, her tone measured. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." Martin chuckled, shaking his head. "Neither was I." For a moment, they simply stood there, the energy between them charged but uncertain. "Can I get you a drink?" Martin asked, breaking the silence. Dr. Lasser hesitated briefly before nodding. "Sure," she said. As Martin signaled to the bartender, he couldn't help but feel a faint sense of hope stirring within him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. "I'm leaving Dr. Lasser back at the hospital," she said, her tone playful as she leaned back in her chair. "Here in the real world, I'm Vicky." "But you already knew that." Martin chuckled, shaking his head. "You wear both hats well." Vicky smiled knowingly, her gaze lingering on him for a moment before continuing. "It wasn't long after my divorce was finalized that I realized something, convincing my husband, ex-husband, that he had nothing in common with a 20-year-old cashier other than their shared interest in extracurricular activities, was a waste of energy. I wore my rings for a while, hoping to make him see sense, but I didn't succeed." Martin raised an eyebrow. "Oh, my God. Are they still together?" Vicky laughed lightly, a sound both dismissive and amused. "You might be surprised, Mr. Miller, but after my divorce was final, I completely lost interest in Wayne's marital status. I have no idea if they're still together, and honestly, I don't care." Martin nodded, appreciating her candor. Before he could respond, the music in the background softened slightly, and Vicky leaned in closer, her lips brushing against his ear as she whispered, "Martin, I'm tired of dancing. But I'm also feeling very lonely, if you know what I mean." Her words sent a shiver down his spine. He turned to meet her gaze, searching her expression for hesitation but finding none. Without a word, he took her hand and led her back to the bar. He paid the tab and informed the bartender they wouldn't need any more drinks. The bartender didn't look surprised, merely nodded in acknowledgement. Vicky had arrived at the club in an Uber, so Martin offered to drive her home. She agreed without hesitation, and they left together. The quiet of the car ride contrasted sharply with the noise and lights of the club. They didn't need to fill the silence, it was comfortable, charged with unspoken anticipation. When they arrived at Martin's apartment, Vicky followed him inside, taking in the understated decor with a nod of approval. Later, they lay tangled together on the bed, the warmth of their shared closeness lulling them into that hazy state between wakefulness and sleep. Vicky stirred slightly, raising her head to look at him. "Martin," she said, her voice a soft murmur, "I just remembered, there was a certain issue with erectile dysfunction in your story, wasn't there? I couldn't help but notice that doesn't seem to be a problem anymore." Martin chuckled, his smile turning sheepish. "You're right. A couple of months after the oak tree incident, I started feeling something, a tingling sensation. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. Over time, well," he gestured vaguely. "Things just started working again. I suppose I healed, physically at least." Vicky smiled mischievously. "Physically, for sure." They laughed together, the sound light and genuine, before settling back into the quiet comfort of the moment. The next morning, Vicky stirred first. She stretched languidly and glanced at Martin, who was still half asleep. "If you're not inviting me to breakfast, you can't complain if I help myself to your kitchen," she teased, slipping out of bed. Martin opened one eye, his lips curling into a lazy smile. "It's too late now. You can stay for breakfast, but lunch is negotiable." She laughed, pulling on his shirt from the night before and heading toward the kitchen. A few minutes later, Martin joined her, freshly showered, just as she was setting plates on the table. The aroma of food filled the air, an omelette, sausages, and buttered toast. "I didn't even know I had sausages in the freezer," Martin remarked as he sat down, his tone amused. "Shows how much you know your own kitchen," Vicky quipped, sliding into the chair opposite him. As they ate, Martin hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Vicky, do you think you're ready for something serious? A real relationship?" She paused, her fork hovering midair. For a moment, he thought he'd overstepped, that she might laugh it off or excuse herself. Instead, she set her fork down and met his gaze. "I think I am," she said slowly, her voice steady. "But I want to take it one step at a time. Is that okay with you?" Martin nodded, relieved. "That's more than okay." They finished their breakfast in companionable silence, the beginnings of something new and unexpected blooming between them. "I hope it's edible," Vicky teased as she set the last plate on the table. Martin took a bite and smiled. "It's delicious. You're a natural." Breakfast was calm, a welcome contrast to the intensity of the previous night. They ate quietly, with Martin taking charge of cleaning the kitchen once they were finished. Vicky leaned against the counter, watching him with a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking," she said after a moment. "About what?" Martin asked without looking up from the sink. "About kids. About how people navigate having, or not having, them," Vicky replied, her tone casual but deliberate. Martin glanced at her, curious. "Go on." "Well, my ex-husband was fixated on the idea of having children, but not through adoption. He saw not having biological kids as some kind of personal failure. And because I was the reason we couldn't have any, well, I think it's safe to say he didn't handle it well." "How does he feel about it now?" Martin asked gently. Vicky shrugged. "I have no idea. After the divorce, I stopped keeping tabs on him. I figured that chapter of my life was closed. For me, though. I'm over 40 now, and I have an adult daughter. Would I have more kids? Sure, but it's not a deal-breaker." She paused, giving Martin a knowing look. "Is it for you?" Martin shook his head. "No. I've made my peace with that part of my life. Besides, I'd much rather focus on the here and now, on enjoying time with people I care about." Vicky smiled. "Glad to hear that." She hesitated for a moment before continuing. "There's something else I want to share, though I'm not exactly proud of it. After my divorce, I felt lost. I needed to feel desirable again, so I went out a lot, bars, clubs, wherever. At first, I didn't care who I left with, as long as it was someone." Martin looked at her, but his expression held no judgment. "Go on," he said softly. Vicky sighed. "Eventually, I became more selective. I stopped settling for the first guy who called me pretty and started choosing people I actually wanted to be with. There were plenty of nights I went home alone, but even then, I found a way to take care of myself." She laughed, a self-deprecating chuckle. "I guess I should be glad I passed whatever test you had in mind last night." Martin smiled warmly. "It wasn't a test, Vicky. I enjoy spending time with you, and that's all that matters." "Well, for what it's worth, I enjoy spending time with you too," she said sincerely. The conversation took a more serious turn as Martin shared his own experiences. "After my accident, I went through something similar. When everything stopped working, I felt like less of a man. I started going out, not to meet anyone in particular, just to prove to myself that I could still, attract someone." Vicky raised an eyebrow. "And?" Martin chuckled wryly. "And I wasn't very picky. I betted women I barely remember now. Let's just say I've ridden a few city bikes and turned a lot of city door handles. Vicky laughed, the sound lightening the mood. Well, at least you're honest about it. Later that evening, Martin and Vicky were at a cozy bar, enjoying drinks and light conversation. The music had dropped to a comfortable level, allowing them to talk freely. The evening was going well, until Martin's expression suddenly shifted. "What's wrong?" Vicky asked, following his gaze. Standing near the entrance was Diana. Their eyes met almost simultaneously, and while Martin's face became unreadable, Diana's lit up with a sly grin as she began walking toward their table. "Who's that?" Vicky whispered. "My ex-wife," Martin replied. Diana wasted no time making her presence known. Well, Marty," she said, her tone dripping with mock sweetness. "Looks like you've been busy." Vicky looked between them, her curiosity piqued. "Is there something I should know, Martin?" she asked playfully, raising an eyebrow. Diana smirked. "Oh, he didn't tell you? We got divorced because he couldn't perform." Martin shrugged nonchalantly, leaving the response to Vicky. To Diana's surprise, Vicky suppressed a quiet giggle. "Really?" she said, feigning interest. "Well, if that's true, Diana, it certainly doesn't seem to be a problem anymore." Diana's face flushed with anger. "You can think whatever you want, but you don't know what it was like. I wouldn't have done what I did if everything was normal." Martin's voice cut through the tension. "Okay, Diana. Here's the truth. Whatever was wrong after my accident, it needed time to heal. If you'd stayed with me, like our vows said, we'd still be married. But you didn't. And that's on you, not me." Diana opened her mouth to respond but stopped short, realizing she'd lost control of the situation. With a glare, she turned and left, leaving Martin and Vicky to exchange amused glances. "Well," Vicky said with a smirk. "She's charming. Let's just say she's not my problem anymore," Martin replied, raising his glass. They clinked their glasses together, letting the moment pass and enjoying the rest of their evening.